Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to today's Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 24th day of October, and the 1st of November is a week from tomorrow. So we're moving towards the last week of October and into November. It's unbelievable. And of course, as we know, the election is November 6th. So it's 2 weeks from yesterday. And things are really popping on the midterm election scene, as I'm sure many of you know, and those are some of the issues I'd like to raise today in our program. But first of all, I'd like to give you the down and dirty, if you will, of ways that you can communicate with us, the household chores, as it were, that we try to share with you every day. If you'd like to come on the air with us and express your thoughts or concerns or hopes or insights or whatever they might be, please know that you're welcome. Please know also that what you've got to say is undoubtedly something that other people listening into this program ought to hear. And that's why we have these direct lines open to you for that particular reason. There are two phone numbers that you can use. Either one will get you into the Head On Radio Network studios, and Agnes will connect you and put you on the air immediately. Both of them are area code 304 numbers. The first one is 304-574-8178. 304-574-8178. The second number, which is a new one, is area code 304, same area code, 640-2829. 640-2829. That's probably the one I'd use because that's the one I remember easiest for some reason. But if you do and come on the air with us, we would love to have you. Please don't hesitate to come on figuring that you're interfering with some pre-planned program that I have. I have an idea where we're going, but I can always postpone them when a listener chooses to share or interact with us. And that's really when things start to happen, when learning takes place, I would suggest. If you are a little bit reluctant to come on the air, but at the same time you'd like to share your thoughts directly with me and trust me to get them on the air for you, I'd be more than happy to do that. You can either send me an email or you can utilize the comment links on our Facebook page. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And on our Facebook page, if you go to the homepage for Facebook, facebook.com, there's a search box at the top. And if you type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, you'll be onto our Facebook page, and you'll see a number of postings on that page. One of them I want to refer to in today's program, what I think is the most recent one. And after each posting, there are two boxes, a share box and a comment box. If you click on share, that will send that particular posting to all the friends on your Facebook page. All your friends, in other words. And of course, that gives us more exposure and potentially brings in more listeners, and we'd love to have that. So if you did that, if you choose to do that, we sure would appreciate it. If you click on the comment button, that will give you an opportunity to comment directly to me, and presumably your comment would be related to that particular posting, but it doesn't have to be. You can make whatever comment you want. In other words, it might be faster and more comfortable for you. I know that email is increasingly becoming outdated, and people are utilizing other forms of communication in cyberspace, other than emails. Maybe it's something to do with all the emails that were hacked around the 2016 election. I don't know, but anyway, it seems to me that technology has taken us a little bit beyond email, and I know many people, especially younger folks, hardly use email anymore at all. But for me, I'm not going to change. I don't change that easily. So, I regularly check my email page, and there's usually something on it, and I get a lot of links and things that people send me. So, I do check my email page regularly. So, if you do send an email, I'll be sure to get it very quickly. Again, I do apologize for missing the program yesterday. As I mentioned, I had a doctor's appointment. But I guess I could probably, I don't know whether it would be right to use my experience as a way to look at the entire healthcare system. But I got to tell you that I had my appointment scheduled yesterday, and I sat in the office for 2 hours waiting to be called. And finally, I had another appointment later in the afternoon, and I had to basically leave. I couldn't wait any longer. And the attendant office manager was very, very kind and sympathetic, and gave me a new appointment in about a month, but understood and said that they were running way behind yesterday for a number of different reasons. I don't really know what they were, but I never before had to wait 2 hours, and I know some people do all the time. That's becoming more and more common as part of our healthcare system, I'm afraid. And since I had canceled yesterday's program for that doctor's appointment, I scheduled another appointment later in the day, which would have been in the second hour of our program. It was at 2 p.m. yesterday afternoon. My appointment was at 10:40, 20 minutes of 11. I sat there until after 12:30, and finally realized that I needed to get out of there, because it was getting to the point, even if I was called, it would probably take 15 to 20 minutes or half an hour with the doctor, and I didn't have it. So I had to leave and reschedule the appointment. So I really didn't gain a whole heck of a lot yesterday. What I did do is lose. I lost 2 hours here in the virtual center, but I figured that it would be close. And as the quarter hours ticked by yesterday, and I was waiting and waiting, at first I said, well, I'm really glad I canceled the program today, because it looks like it's going to run awfully close to 1. Well, when it got to the point where it was going to run awfully close to 2, that's when I finally had to leave. There are a number of issues that are going on, and no way in the world can I deal with all of them today. I'll have to hold a few of them until the first of the week. But there's one item that really isn't an issue that we are dealing with today. It's a little bit out of sync with the other things I had in mind today, but I wanted to share it with you anyway, because I found it, and it relates to something that we spent an awful lot of time on in previous programs. It relates specifically to James Madison, and it relates specifically to one of the Federalist papers. And I'm going to mention the Federalist paper, not necessarily because I want to spend a lot of time on it, But there are a couple of things in this Federalist paper that I have to admit I had not noticed. And the book that we were dealing with last week, the Gary Wills book, A Necessary Evil, in reading that book, I came across a reference to Federalist number 43. And I thought, I don't think I've ever seen anybody make reference to that particular Federalist paper before. So I went to it and I reread it. I had read it before, but it was a long time. But it's not, when you start looking, especially Madison's Federalist papers, besides number 10, the key ones are 39 and 51. And they're, all three of them are papers written by James Madison, and they're very significant and they're frequently cited. But I don't believe I had ever seen anyone cite Federalist 43 before. So I went back and I looked at it. I read the entire thing, and I found a couple of things in there that I wanted to share with you, because I'm afraid if I don't, I'll lose them. If you know what I mean, I won't get them in. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about Federalist 3. It's the last of a series of Federalist papers that deal with the various powers given to the federal government under the Constitution. And those powers are divided into 4 different categories, and each of those categories has a separate Federalist paper associated with it. This is the last one in that series. And so the first line in the paper, in number 43, says the 4th class of powers given to the central government comprises the following miscellaneous powers. And obviously what 43 is a list of powers that don't relate to themes or particular issues. They're kind of unrelated, isolated powers, if you will. Madison calls them miscellaneous powers. They're important, but they're not part of an ongoing theme which takes significant space in the Constitution. And there are, in Federalist 43, there are, I believe, 9. There are 9 specific powers addressed, all in this one paper. I'm not going to spend that much time on any of them except one, but I'll make you aware of what they are. The first power that Madison deals with, and of course what he does is justify the need for each of these in a paragraph or two after the particular power is identified. The first one that Madison deals with in Federalist number 43 is a power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited time to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. This is the right that establishes what we call today intellectual property. It protects your ideas which you initiate. And the idea is that if you come up with an idea that nobody else has come up with before, you have a right to whatever benefits come or are associated with that particular invention or creation. And as Madison says, the Constitution makes reference to the fact that the purpose of protecting intellectual property is to promote the progress of science and useful arts in our society. And Madison defends that. And he talks about the fact that that right goes all the way back to Great Britain, where authors were able to copyright things that they wrote under principles of common law. The second power Madison deals with is the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over the district, over the United States Capitol. All the Constitution says is that there'll be 10 square miles of property set aside for the national capital. But the Constitution doesn't say where it is. That question is not resolved until the early 1790s during Alexander Hamilton's financial program and the debates. The decision is made by Hamilton in order to get one of the pieces of his program through, the assumption of state debts. He's running into Southern opposition. And what Hamilton does is promise Southern delegates that he will use his influence to get the South the national capital if a few of them switch their votes and give him the assumption of state debts. And of course, that's how Washington, D.C. is constructed where it is. The Constitution gives the federal government exclusive power over that 10 square mile area, which is going to be the seat of government. And Madison points out that every government has that power. And it's reasonable to expect that our government would as well. The third power that Madison addresses in Federalist number 43 is the power to declare the punishment of treason. And we talked about that in terms of impeachment. The fourth power, is the power to admit new states into the Union, but no new state can be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state. And of course, that's part of West Virginia's history here, because West Virginia seceded from Virginia, if you will, in order to stay in the Union when Virginia made the voted to secede prior to the Civil War. Forces in West Virginia and those forces that supported them used that opportunity to break West Virginia away from Virginia. So it's ironic, if you think about it, that West Virginia was created as the result of secession in order to have a separate government so it wouldn't have to secede from the Union. I think that's particularly interesting. Number 5, the fifth power, is the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. And this, of course, is necessary as states are coming into the Union to guarantee every state the right. The next one, number 6, to guarantee to every state a republican form of government, to protect each of these states against invasion, and on the application of its legislature or of its executive, its governor, when the legislature is not able to be convened, against domestic violence. And this is the one that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on today. There are others relating to debts, amendments, 2 different ways of amending the Constitution, etc. All of them are addressed in number 43. But the power that gets the most attention in number 43 is the 6th one that Madison identifies, which is the power to guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government, to protect each of them against invasion, and on application of its legislature or its executive, to protect the state against domestic violence. And Madison points out, and there's quite an explanation in which he's defending this power, and he basically addresses first the issue of republican government. And he said a confederacy founded on republican principles and composed of republican members clearly has a right to the authority needed to defend itself, to defend the republic. And so the idea that the federal government under the Constitution would have the responsibility to ensure that every state is entitled to a Republican form of government. And basically, Madison makes the point that this does not necessarily mean federal government interference in a state's government. The only requirement of the state's government is that it be Republican in form, that it not violate the principles of republicanism. And then Madison talks about the last portion of that, which is guaranteeing the state or protecting the state against domestic violence, internal war, civil war, as it were. And he spends quite a bit of time on that, and that's where I want to go, because I want to share a couple of things in here that I thought were extremely significant. One of them is the idea of majority rule. And Madison raises the question that obviously in our society we function on the principle of majority rule. But Madison points out that oftentimes minorities can become majorities by enlisting people into their cause. And what he's referring to specifically are immigrants. And given what's going on today with the so-called caravan coming through Mexico right now and headed to the United States, last number I saw was in the neighborhood of 7,000 people in this caravan, and the president is promising that they will not be allowed into the United States, and if necessary, he will basically use the army, use the military to defend the country against the invasion of this mob. And you may also have noted that the president is suggesting that Democrats are behind this caravan, that sympathizers of the Democratic Party went into Guatemala and paid some of these migrants to initiate the trek toward the border. The timing, of course, coinciding with our midterm elections. And so what the president is doing is using fear of this invasion, as he calls it, for political purposes. It's going to frighten people, the people he wants to vote, so that they'll come to the polls and vote Republican and support him. And he's blaming the Democrats for initiating the march. He's blaming George Soros for funding it. It seems to me not out of, not out of common sense to link the fact that an explosive device showed up Monday at the home of George Soros. And a like device showed up at the home of Bill and Hillary Clinton yesterday. And Agnes was telling me that there was also such a device at the Obama residence. So the fact that the president of the United States is blaming the opposing party for inciting this kind of mob violence, and George Soros for paying for it, is obviously producing violence. And it's obviously increasing fear in this country. And there's no question that all of this is being used for political reasons. My point the point I wanted to make is that all the way back in the Federalist Papers in 43, when Madison is defending the power of the central government, the right of the central government to not only guarantee Republican government to each state, but also when called upon to use federal power to crush domestic violence, mobs. Madison says, may it not happen, in fine, that a minority of citizens may become a majority of persons by the accession of alien residents, of a casual concourse of adventurers, or of those whom the Constitution of the state has not admitted to the rights of suffrage. And at the time this was written, 1788, what that refers to are those prevented to vote because they don't own property, or indeed slaves. So the implication is that a minority within a state could become an oppressive majority by including or adding aliens, immigrants, slaves, or the unemployed poor, those without property. So what Madison is suggesting is the very realities of our society and its division between those who have property and those who don't is constantly going to be the source of violence in our society. Always there's that threat. And Madison is insisting that the federal government had the power to repress it. And you can go all the way back to the Whiskey Rebellion, all the way back to Shays' Rebellion. You can go all the way back to the 17th century to Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia in 1675. And you see the same kinds of things. And that is the power of government being used to support what we call today the establishment, the property owners, the powerful. There is a tradition in our society that political power almost always finds its way into the camp of the well-to-do and the powerful. Madison goes on and says, I take no notice of an unhappy species of population abounding in some of the states, who during the calm of regular government are sunk below the level of men, but who in the tempestuous scenes of civil violence may emerge into the human character and give a superiority of strength to any party with which they may associate themselves. And of course, what he's referring to there is slaves. Again, he refers to slaves as an unhappy species of the population abounding in some of the states, who during the calm of regular government, in other words, during peaceful times, are sunk below the level of men. What he's referring to is the institution of slavery, defining slaves as less than human. But Madison points out that during periods of domestic violence, these people who are less than human may emerge into the human character and thereby give superiority of strength to any party with which they may associate themselves. I think that's very significant. It's significant that he doesn't use the word slave, but on the other hand, there's no doubt as to what he means. And what he is suggesting very clearly is that the very existence of slavery creates a perpetual danger of civil violence. This population is always susceptible to being used in the interests of benefiting even a minority. Madison goes on after this in the next paragraph to deal with a second issue that I think is significant here in 43. Besides that one, about the issue of slaves and the issue of immigration. There's no question that if you look through the history of this country in the area of immigration, you begin to find that immigration is always a political issue. Always. And at certain times, it seems to be highlighted. We're obviously in one of those right now. There's no question that Republican candidates are stressing the immigration issue in the lead up to these midterm elections. It's also significant, it seems to me, that they are almost to the man or woman, mostly men with the Republicans, but not always. The race in Arizona, for example, with McSally is getting a lot of attention. But the issue clearly is that immigration is being used as a political weapon here. And that's been true for a long time. Then Madison goes into another issue about violence, domestic violence. He says, in cases where it may be doubtful on which side justice lies, same issue, different point. When the situation is so explosive that violence is imminent, and it's hard to tell which side is right and wrong in the debate that leads up to this violence, what better umpires, this is Madison talking, what better umpires could be desired by two violent factions flying to arms and tearing a state to pieces than the representatives of Confederate states not heeded by the local flame? In other words, it's in a situation where violence is imminent, where the situation is so hot, so dangerous, so explosive, that common sense and reason don't have a chance. What Madison is suggesting is that's exactly the time when you want to bring cooler heads in. So the federal government's responsibility to protect states against the threat of civil disobedience, of internal domestic violence, he argues, can be a very positive thing because it can cool down issues that are about to explode, because you're bringing cooler heads into the picture, so to speak. To the impartiality of judges, they would unite the affection of friends. Happy would it be if such a remedy for its infirmities could be enjoyed by all free governments. If a project equally effectual could be established for the universal peace of mankind. I want to stress that, because it flies in the face of this idea that Madison is accused of being totally a prisoner of the idea that greed and self-interest always drives human behavior, that principles and ideals and values don't. Madison is always seen from the perspective of what he says in Federalist number 10, that factions, the violence of faction is sown into the nature of man. This is man's nature. This is human nature. Man is self-interested and greedy and will always unite with those who are as greedy as he is to create power in numbers to get what they want. So Madison is always seen as the cynic, as the negative, as the person who's never positive. But we saw in a number of other Federalist papers that there's evidence in Madison that Madison, while he admits that self-interest is important in trying to understand and regulate or control human behavior, he also says that there are other qualities within man, in other words, other aspects of human nature, which give us much more optimism. And if you remember in one Federalist paper, he makes the point that right and wrong can dominate when man is by himself. But what makes the situation bad is when that person unites with other people with the same self-interest and you create a faction. That's when right and wrong tends to be pushed aside. That's when, according to Madison, bad things happen. But you can't say that Madison is down on or negative towards human nature, because there's too many things in the Federalist Papers to point out the opposite, that Madison does indeed have faith in the people's ability to hold their leaders accountable and to become informed on the issues so that they can vote intelligently. Now here's Madison talking about yet another advantage, and that is the idea of bringing cooler heads into an explosive situation so that reason and common sense can prevail when emotions have taken over. And you may remember in one Federalist paper, Madison made the point that we all agree in Republican government that government should respond to the interest of constituents. And what Madison says is, when human reason is operative amongst the people, government has a responsibility to pay attention to the people and to respond to majorities. But when passion takes over, when emotions take over, and common sense is pushed into the background, what Madison is saying here is that's when you need cooler heads. That's when you got to bring people who aren't directly involved in the situation into the picture to help find a solution to it. That's the basis, for example, of arbitration agreements. You try to bring in an objective third party. That's the whole rationale behind the jury system, is bringing in people into a courtroom who have not prejudged the situation, listen to both sides of the argument, and then go off by themselves and reach a conclusion as to which side is telling the truth. That's the basis of our whole political system, is man's ability to reason, to think, to deliberate, to negotiate, to analyze, to evaluate. And this number 43 contains a section which adds further evidence to this idea of Madison. Madison said at one point, if human nature is as evil as some people say it is, then Republican government would not be possible. Because what you would be saying is people can never do the right thing. Common sense and reason can never prevail. Madison said, I refuse to accept that. So in that sense, there's a much more positive side, optimistic side of Madison coming out. And you can see it right here. Happy would it be, he says, if such a remedy, cooler heads, for its infirmities could be enjoyed by all free governments, if a project equally effectual could be established for the universal peace of mankind. Wouldn't it be great, he's saying, if we could so establish and convince people of this truth, that when reason is not possible, when emotions are too high, that's the time to call in cooler heads, to call in an arbitrator, to call in people who have not prejudged the situation, who are not directly involved in the debate or the controversy. So I think what Madison is giving us here, and I think it's an important point to keep in mind, this is one of the advantages that Madison sees in the Constitution of the United States over the Articles of Confederation. Because the Articles put power at the state level and put power in the legislative branch within the states, which is that branch closest to the people, power too often can be controlled by passionate majorities. People who aren't thinking, but are operating on emotions, have the power and the ability to take power when power is that close to them on the state level. But going back to Federalist number 10, Madison argues, if you enlarge the sphere, if you put power on the national level, then chances are you're not going to get the impassioned, heated majorities. He said you make it less likely that a majority will even exist. Or if it does, those who are part of it won't even know that they are part of a majority. All that's changed now with social media, and I think I've made that point before. But I do believe that this optimistic thing about mankind, about Madison talking about, wouldn't it be great if we could get all mankind to buy into this? Would have fewer wars, would have fewer disagreements, would have much less violence. If common cooler heads were being brought into the picture all the time, because man had pretty much become convinced that that's the way you resolve all problems, is by conversation, by negotiation, by deliberation, by compromise. That's the model of the Constitution itself. I think this is a very, very important point. And I'm probably the only one that would basically suggest that Federalist number 43 may have to be considered as one of the more important Federalist papers. But the fact of the matter is, depending on what the subject is, when you read them, they almost all of them are. They're extremely revealing papers, but they're hard to read. And the irony is, if you're reading Federalist number 43, you're liable to read right over this, unless you're reading it very carefully. So that's the reason I raised the issue today, because I didn't want the opportunity to pass. In talking about the issue of immigration and talking about the political uses of immigration, for evidence, just listen to what the president is saying now while this caravan continues to march its way through Mexico. The estimates are that it's still 1,000 miles away from the U.S. border. So the likelihood is that they're not going to get here by election time. But the fact of the matter is, that's really what the president is focusing on, is the role of Democrats in creating this. And it ties perfectly in with his inclination of late to make reference to the Democrats as a spokesman for the mob, and threatening mob violence and threatening open borders. Anybody who wants to come into the United States is going to be allowed to come in. I heard a discussion yesterday, and it was a discussion on the radio, on Sirius Radio, in a program that has just recently begun by Chris Cuomo, who has an evening program on CNN 5 nights a week. A couple of weeks ago, Chris Cuomo launched a program on Sirius Radio. And I happened to hear it yesterday. And the conversation was about immigration. It was about this particular march, or this particular caravan, as it's being called. The argument was about illegal aliens, illegal immigration. And the point that was being emphasized was the fact that so many American businesses rely on immigrant labor because it's cheap labor. And if we ever really want to do anything about immigration and about the threat, the problems, potential problems of immigration, one of the first things we're going to have to do is find a way to stop employers from requiring illegal immigrants in order to meet their bottom line. Because we're in an age where businesses, corporations, are expected to show steady profit, quarterly profits. The idea that you got to be able to show on a quarterly basis that the value of the stock is going up, because that's the only way you can encourage investors to continue to buy into your company and thereby provide you capital for operations. And this short-term profit, this short-term emphasis on the bottom line, oftentimes causes long-term considerations to be pushed onto the back burner. It used to be that it was the long-term profit of the free enterprise system that was its strength. Investors were encouraged to invest in the stock market because of the guaranteed long-term benefits. But with the arrival of day trading, the emergence of computers, the internet, it becomes possible to wheel and deal in stocks on a daily basis. That's all people do, some people. And in order to play that game, a corporation has to be able to demonstrate profit on a regular basis. You can't say to an investor, look at what our stock has done over a 10-year period, or over the last quarter century, or whatever. Investors aren't looking for that. They're looking for immediate profit. And they want some evidence that it's there. And corporate managers, by definition, do everything they can do to provide it. And the surest way to be able to show short-term profit is to cut labor expenses. reduce salaries, reduce the numbers of employees, reduce benefits. A lot of companies are doing that by subcontracting. In other words, cutting back on the number of full-time employees by contracting out for particular benefits or particular services that the company needs, rather than permanently employing these people. All of these strategies are seen as sure ways to demonstrate short-term profit, ongoing steady profit. Well, the fact of the matter is many of these corporations rely on immigrant labor because that's the guaranteed lowest labor costs they're going to get. There aren't any benefits associated with it, no responsibilities, no obligations to the employee, no pension plans, no retirement plans, no health care, none of that stuff. And so corporations are notorious for keeping the bottom line down by employing illegal labor. And as long as they're doing this, illegal immigrants are going to continue to come to this country because there's opportunity here. There are jobs here. Obviously, organized labor is always against large numbers of immigrants coming in because they create a labor surplus and they make it less difficult for organized workers to gain benefits because they don't have leverage. There are too many other people available who'll do the work. So all of this, it seems to me, is important. But I wanted to share this with you in light of the comments that I was intending to make today, and I did make, about immigration and the political issues surrounding immigration. And I think this is one, and it's often overlooked. And I happened to hear this discussion yesterday on Cuomo's program on Sirius. And I kept thinking it relates clearly to this issue of Federalist number 43, which is what I wanted to raise, which is Madison's awareness that the availability of immigrants as well as slaves and non-voters because of property qualifications for voting, all of those things create a potential pool of manpower for those minorities who are willing to use the threat of violence to get what they want. And I think it's so long-sighted, so prescient is the word of Madison, to be able to anticipate some of the threats that society would face in a future that there was no way in the world he could clearly see. But he could see the fact that more and more people were not becoming property owners, and that it was important for the nation to do something to tie these people, hourly workers, if you will, to the state, to the system. The idea of civic education. And that's where it came from. And on the same note, before we go off it entirely, we're moving toward the top of our first hour here. I wanted to share something that many of you may have seen in the media yesterday, very sad. That former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor yesterday put out an announcement that she would no longer be making public appearances because she's in the early stages of Alzheimer's. And many, of course, may remember that that's the reason she resigned from the Supreme Court, was to take care of her husband who had Alzheimer's. He has since died. Now she has it, and she's withdrawing from public service, from public visibility. She was engaging in speaking to groups and all that. She's not going to do it anymore. because, as she said, she's beginning to slip into the final stage of her life. And it's obviously very, very, very sad, I think. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that as kind of an additional comment, because I think it's something that everybody ought to take notice, make notice of. But that is essentially what I wanted to emphasize about Federalist number 43. It's a paper that gets little attention, but as it turns out, there's quite a bit in it. And as I mentioned, there are a total of 9 powers that Madison talks about here. That's the 6th one. I would say almost half of the paper of Federalist number 43 is devoted to that number 6. Number 7 relates to debts contracted before the adoption of the Constitution. These are primarily Southern planters who slipped into tremendous debt with British financiers, British bankers, and British merchants who were willing to loan Southern planters money in bad crop years. Number 8 is the power to provide for amendments to be ratified by 3/4 of the states under 2 exceptions only. And number 9 is on ratification of the Constitution. Ratification by conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states ratifying the same. And as I mentioned, that leads some people to believe that, technically speaking, the Constitutional Convention is illegal. The Constitution is illegal because the Articles of Confederation required a unanimous vote of all the states to be changed, to be amended. And so when the nationalists, the Federalists, made the decision at the Constitutional Convention to scrap the Articles and replace them with a totally new government, and then allowed that only 9 states would be needed to ratify it, that raises serious questions about the constitutionality of the Constitution. Because the new government begins with only 11 of the 13 states. North Carolina doesn't ratify until the government goes into effect, and Rhode Island doesn't ratify until the time of the Bill of Rights in 1791. So, anyway, that's the issue that I wanted to deal with in relation to Federalist number 43. The other issues that I wanted to deal with deal more or less with contemporary society, with situations that we've got going on right now that relate directly to the Constitution of the United States. This is the posting that I mentioned that I would be referring to from our Facebook page. I put it on there the other day. It relates to comments by Mitch McConnell that the Trump tax cuts passed last December of 2017, which blew a $1.5 trillion hole in the deficit. In other words, added what was anticipated to be $1.5 billion, but it's becoming clear that it's actually going to be a trillion, rather. It's going to be closer to $2 trillion at the end of 10 years. Mitch McConnell the other day denied that the tax cut had any impact on the deficit at all. And his argument is that the only way we can take on the deficit is to go after what he called entitlements: Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And if you're like me, you resent the suggestion that Social Security is an entitlement program, when in fact you pay into it and your parents paid into it. It was an entitlement program for the first round of recipients who hadn't put anything into it. But once you move from first generation into the second and so on, the fact of the matter is all of us are investing in our retirements through Social Security, through this federal program. It's unfair, it seems to me, for anybody to refer to it as an entitlement program. It's not a giveaway. Not entirely. Although the fact of the matter is, with people living as long as they live now, it stands to reason that a lot of people get more back in Social Security benefits than they've ever put in during their working years. But I'm not sure that even that entitles, qualifies for Social Security to be labeled an entitlement program. But the issue here is Mitch McConnell and his argument that what's happening to the deficit requires that we do something about Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, refusing to acknowledge that the Republican tax cut had any impact on the deficit at all. I think that's incredibly important. I want to pick it up after we break. But we have gone just beyond the top of the hour. It's 2 minutes after the top of the hour, 2 minutes after 2 in the East. I'd like to pause for 4 or 5 minute break. Then we'll come back and get into our second hour here on this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to this, our second hour on this Wednesday. Today is the 24th day in the month of October in the year 2018. If you're just joining us, it's a pleasure to have you with us. We spent the most good portion, if you were not with us in our first hour and are just joining us, we spent most of the first hour looking at Federalist number 43, which is one of the least cited of the Federalist Papers. It was written by James Madison, and I had been in the book that we were dealing with last week, The Necessary Evil by Gary Wills. I was taken by the fact that he called attention to or made reference to something that he wanted to comment on in Federalist number 43, and I had never seen anyone cite Federalist number 43 before for anything. In all my reading, I've never come across people who've gone to that particular paper. So out of curiosity more than anything else, I couldn't even remember what was in it. So I went back and reread it, and I read it very carefully. And lo and behold, I found what I think are gems in there. And we spent most of the first hour talking specifically about them. Of course, we talked a lot about the March of Immigrants, the so-called caravan. President Trump is calling it a caravan, blaming the Democrats for it. And we made reference also to the fact that incendiary devices have turned up at the homes of Bill and Hillary Clinton, George Soros, Barack and Michelle Obama. We're into a very, very tough period. And it just makes these elections coming up in 13 days so important. You know, it's hard to say that this election is more important than any other, because people always say that every election. And we know that there are a number of people, for whatever reason, who will not vote. No matter what happens, they will not vote. But it's beginning to look like the turnout in this particular midterm election is going to be higher, because it appears that Republican voters are fired up. And needless to say, Democrats are as well.
Bill?
Yes.
If I can make one point. This one really is important because we've never had a president claim he's a nationalist before.
That's right. That's right. Good point.
1939 is coming up.
Yep. Yeah, you bet. That's right. That's that word nationalist. He proudly proclaimed himself a nationalist yesterday, and all of that is it indicates ignorance of history. I mean, he has no recognition at all, Agnes, of what he's. I don't think of what he's saying.
He thinks he knows physics too, because his uncle was a physicist. So I mean,
yeah, I caught that.
But
taught at MIT, I think, or something.
MIT, and he talked extensively with him about it.
And he talked about the fact that since one of his uncles taught at MIT, that means that he's got a gift for science built into his DNA or something. I mean, it's unbelievable.
There are websites out there that put up his military school photo, headshot, and talk about his military service. I kid you not. So,
yeah,
we've never been in this point before.
So your point is, I agree with you. I think this one is.
This is like having baby Hitler.
This is our last shot at getting this guy, I think. I really do.
And if we don't, then we will have a monarchy rather than a democracy.
There'll be no holds barred.
Right.
And it's already happening that he's pretty much using the Supreme Court. In fact, that was in an article that I happened to see in this morning's one of the major papers, that Jeff Sessions and the Department of Justice are bypassing local and district courts, circuit and district courts, and going directly to the Supreme Court to get decisions that are beneficial to them because too often the Justice Department is being rebuffed in the lower courts.
What do you
And,
do with that?
And so basically he's kind of using the Supreme Court as, and I think I made this statement to Agnes when we were chatting earlier. He's looking at the Supreme Court as the judicial version of Fox News for him. In other words, he's pretty much taking over and controls Fox News, in the sense that it's a network that totally defends everything he does. Now he's got a majority on the Supreme Court that more than likely is going to support everything he wants to do legally, judicially. So he's taking advantage of that. And the sum total is, in spite of the conservative claim, I'm thinking of Clarence Thomas specifically, of support for separation of powers, the fact of the matter is this president is obliterating separation of powers, and those that scream the loudest about it are silent. So, unbelievable. Thank you for that comment about nationalism, Nancy. I mean, Agnes, that totally slipped my mind.
You're welcome, Bill, because covering the Federalist Papers, I realize that they've done everything they can to pretty much nullify the Constitution. So
yeah, that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
And once that's gone,
we don't have a leg to stand on.
We don't have a leg. I mean, we don't have any appeal. The suppression of voters' right to vote that's going on all over the country now is not drawing one word of concern. But I mean, it's just unbelievable. There's no place to appeal to.
Well, we're not hearing any of the voices going against that, but of course, our government is trying to create a civil war and doing a good job of it.
Oh, yeah. There was a media report I saw this morning that this Republican candidate for governor in Georgia was caught making a statement about the Democratic efforts to get out the vote efforts in Georgia and how they were registering thousands and thousands of new voters. And he made the point to his audience, that it looks like unprecedented numbers of people are going to exercise their right to vote. And if they do that, we're in trouble, is what he's saying. And as the fact that he still is Secretary of State and he's sitting on 53,000 voter applications, registrations for voting. And he mentioned yesterday that he has no intention of resigning, right up till Election Day. So he's been urged by his Democratic opponent to resign his position as Secretary of State because it creates a flagrant conflict of interest.
And who do you file an ethics complaint with?
Yeah.
I mean, so
how do you do it?
You really can't, because it would just be file 13. They throw it in the trash and go right on.
Yeah, and the story that's coming out of North Dakota about the Native Americans out there who have post office boxes rather than street addresses, and therefore their applications for registration to vote are being delayed.
Well, it makes you wonder what 911 is doing out there too.
Yeah.
Because once 911 is implemented, you get a actual street number.
Right. And I know in our case in Summers County, my wife's place got a street number a while ago for that same reason. Because 911 requires, they want instant notification as to where each home is located, each residence is located.
And you put up a little plate out in your yard that has that street number on it.
That's right.
And that's the identification. So, something's not right there.
No, it sure isn't. But what we're experiencing is frightening, because there's no recourse. And the ultimate recourse used to be the Supreme Court, and it's gone. And the only recourse left, it appears, is the voting booth. And that's being suppressed in any number of different ways around the country. It's amazing. Amazing. Anyway, we're at 17 minutes after the hour already. I can't believe we're that far along, but we are. Let me quickly give you the phone numbers if you'd like to call, and invite you also to share your thoughts with me in an email or on our Facebook page, whichever you find most convenient. If you'd like to get on the air with us, we would love to have you. The two numbers that you would need, one of them will get you, either one of them will get you online, will get you into the studios, and Agnes will get you on the air. Both of them are 304 area codes. The first one, 304-574-8178. The second one, 304-640-2829. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. O'Brien has an E in it, not an A. Lowercase, all one word. waobrien906@gmail.com. And if you go to our Facebook page, just type the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution into the search box at the top of the homepage of Facebook, and you'll see postings there. And you're going to see the one that I'm making reference to. I want to go back to here in this our second hour. It's one of the. I think it could be the last posting I put on there. I'm not sure, but it's one of the last ones. So that means it's near the top of our Facebook page. And if you go to the Facebook page, you can go to any one of the postings there and click on the comment link. And that gives you the opportunity to make the direct comment to me. I get it. And, if it's something that you would like to get on the air, I'll do the very best I can do to do that for you if you're reluctant to come on yourself. But let me know that you are invited to call one of those two numbers and come on the air directly. We would love to have you. We were talking at the top of the hour when we took our break about Mitch McConnell's statement a few days ago about Republican intentions to go after Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security in order to address the problem of a ballooning, exploding deficit. And yet, McConnell's determination to not link the Trump tax cuts to the increase of the deficit. And of course, in the minds of many people, myself included, that pretty well validates the assumptions that many of us had at the time of the tax cuts before they were passed, that the purpose of this tax cut bill was to create a deficit problem so severe that it would justify the Congress going after Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And now here comes Mitch McConnell saying exactly that. I think many of us pretty well assumed that. I don't have anything to deny that. But a few days ago, I can give you the exact date. It's on the 18th. Today's the 24th, so 6 days ago, Paul Waldman wrote a piece in the Washington Post in which he pointed out that while it's true that Mitch McConnell would like to go after these programs directly, he doesn't want to do it with a Republican in the White House. Waldman's argument is that Mitch McConnell will probably be reluctant to go after these programs directly until a Democrat retakes the White House. because given the fact that the Republicans currently control the Senate, the House, the White House, and even the Supreme Court, for McConnell to lead the charge to go after Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, as popular as they are, would be too politically dangerous. He may be many things, but taking political risks is not one of them. He basically is very, very politically astute. And that's Waldman's point. Waldman admits that McConnell would love to go after these programs. But so long as Republicans control every facet of government, he's probably not going to do that. What he's going to do is wait until once again government is divided and we have a Democrat in the White House. Then they can do what they do best in Congress, which is obstruct. And the justification for going after these programs would be the deficit. Waldman's evidence is pretty convincing, because that's exactly what McConnell did to Barack Obama. When Obama came to Congress looking for a stimulus package to blunt the recession that hit the nation in 2008, Americans were suffering. Yet Obama was unable to get the stimulus package that he wanted, which would be big enough to offset the recession and turn the direction of the economy around. McConnell started to scream about the concern over the deficit. And the fact of the matter is, that's exactly the time when deficit spending is justified. It's deficit spending that gives government the ability to influence the economy. If it's slowed down to the point that you have a recession, then you want to stimulate it. And the way to stimulate it is to inject money into it. That's what Obama wanted to do. McConnell raised the issue of the deficit in order to make that less possible. Consequently, the recession of 2008 was much more severe and lasted longer than it needed to, because McConnell was playing the role of Republican obstructionist against Barack Obama. The idea being that if he did that, then they would have something to run against Obama on. In addition to that point, Waldman goes back to, and let me find the period. Goes back to the story of Joe Biden when he was vice president. In conversations with Republican senators at that time, they explained to him why they couldn't work with him, because Biden had friends on both sides of the aisle in the Senate from his role as vice president. And he had been a senator, he had been a member of the United States Senate for so long from the state of Delaware that he had friends on both sides of the aisle. And he was calling on those friends, those Republican friends, to work with him. And according to the story that Waldman repeats, they told Biden, for the next 2 years, we can't let you succeed in anything. That's our ticket to coming back. Unquote. So in effect, Politics always comes first with Mitch McConnell. Again, another example. Early in 2008, in the face of the recession, during George W. Bush's last year in office, McConnell led the Republicans in approving a $152 billion stimulus to put money in the people's pockets just prior to the election in 2008. In other words, this was the way that they believed they could beat Obama in the November elections in 2008. Put money in people's pockets all of a sudden with a stimulus, and they would vote for you. Not a mention of what that $152 billion would do to the deficit, because the issue was political. Then along comes Obama in his first year in office, trying to get a more generous stimulus package in order to offset the recession. And McConnell won't give. He plays the role of obstructionist. So it's very clear to Waldman, and I think he makes a very, very good point, that while it's true that McConnell and the Republicans would like to take on or go after these programs, these popular programs, for political reasons, they probably won't do it while President Trump is still in the White House. But if a Democrat is elected in 2020, be prepared. The difference, however, is that there are a lot more Republican senators up for re-election in 2020 than there are in 2018. Consequently, the Democrats don't have much of a chance in getting control of the Senate in this year's elections, but they have a much better one in 2020. And of course, in theory, this is all assuming that the Democrats will be able to take control of the House after the elections on November 6th. We'll see, because it looks like the gap in House races is closing. But I do believe Paul Waldman has a very, very significant point in that particular article. I think it's a point well taken. Back to the elections. There are two things as we're into the 2 weeks before the elections. We're actually within 2 weeks of the midterm elections on November 6th. There are two issues that I would like to comment on, and this is, kind of for me, the issue that we really ought to devote the rest of our program on today. It's just that we have 30 minutes left approximately in our program. But I think, it is time to deal with both of these issues, and I think they're both so important. The first one is one we talked about before, the fear issue. I was talking about it earlier in our first hour in relation to the immigrants coming through Mexico right now, and the president's promise to use the military to stop them from coming into this country. In other words, whether these people are coming in search of asylum or not, they're not going to get in, even though there is an international right to seek asylum from asylum from violence. They're not going to get it. The president is arguing that there are Middle Easterners scattered throughout this march, this caravan, that they're potential terrorists. And they're using this migrant march to the southern border as a way to get into the country to commit terrorist acts. And a combination of the flow of immigrants itself and the threat of terrorists among the immigrants and criminals and members of gangs and all these other things is creating an element of fear in the country, which is beginning to frighten a lot of people, and I'm one. And I think the fact that incendiary devices, explosive devices, have shown up in the last couple of days at the residences of Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack and Michelle Obama, and George Soros is significant, because I think the climate is suggesting just that. The President of the United States, for political purposes, in order to get out Republicans' voters, is using this element of fear to frighten Republicans to the polls. But there's more to this element of fear than that. And what I'm speaking specifically of is the threat to minority voters. The threat to try to suppress votes in the upcoming elections. Because everybody knows that most of these votes from inner cities are going to be Democratic votes. And the president is undertaking actions which are clearly designed to instill fear into numbers of minority voters in this country. He is threatening, he is saying that because of a threat that doesn't even exist, which is fraudulent voting, federal agents are going to watch very carefully the polls in 2 weeks in order to make sure that everybody who tries to vote is legitimate, when in fact there's not one bit of evidence of voter fraud. But on the other hand, the president is conjuring up the fear of voter fraud in order to justify the suppression of voters. Because a lot of people are going to be afraid to go to the polls because the president is threatening legal action against them if they go. I believe it was yesterday's New York Times, Jake Johnson had a piece with this title: Trump threatens democracy with one of the most naked attempts to suppress voters in modern times, unquote. This was in Monday's Times, the 22nd. I want to share with you some of the quotes on this particular issue. Over the weekend, the president, in one of his tweets, warned of what he called mass voter fraud. And there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support that. A group called the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law has attacked the president for deploying what it calls Jim Crow tactics to suppress minority voter turnout just 2 weeks before the midterm elections. The president and executive director of that group, Kristen Clark, writes the following, quote, President Trump's statement regarding vote fraud is one of the most naked attempts to promote voter suppression that we've ever seen in modern times. The president, she says, declared that all levels of government and law enforcement are watching carefully for violations at the polls this time around. Here's the president's tweet, dated October 21st, which was Sunday. All levels of government and law enforcement are watching carefully for voter fraud, including during early voting. Cheat at your own peril. Violators will be subject to maximum penalties, both civil and criminal, says President Trump in the 21st of October tweet. This, Clark argued, is part of an ongoing right-wing effort to, quote, promote fear and incite law enforcement to action in ways that would chill voter participation in this particular midterm election cycle. Meanwhile, she says, the administration and the Justice Department's silence about widespread voter suppression has gone unnoticed. To date, the Justice Department has failed to file one single case to enforce the Voting Rights Act and has failed to take any action to protect the rights of minority voters. Instead, we see the president using his platform to promote unsubstantiated false claims about vote fraud, unquote. And then she said, what is most dangerous about the president's statement is the suggestion that government and law enforcement across the country are activating to prosecute voters. This is nothing more than an open, brazen attempt to use the threat of criminal prosecution to intimidate minority voters, an old familiar tactic that dates back to the Jim Crow era. Bernie Sanders said the same thing in his own tweet on Twitter. Don't let them get away with this, Sanders says. Donald Trump and Republicans know that they have to lie about voter fraud, which is virtually non-existent, in order to suppress and intimidate voters in order to win. Don't let them get away with it, says Bernie Sanders. And of course, we know that Brian Kemp, the Republican candidate for governor in Georgia, continues to hold the Secretary of State's office during the election. He's already purged hundreds of thousands of voters from the rolls in the weeks leading up to the election. David Klein on Sunday said in a tweet, it's clear they're going to try to steal the midterms to whatever extent they can. If it works, I'm not sure what can legally be done about it. The Supreme Court killed the Voting Rights Act 5 years ago, before Gorsuch, before Kavanaugh. Now, with a clear 5-4 conservative majority on the court, it leaves little room for recourse this court is not going to play the traditional role of appeal, the court of last appeal that it has traditionally played. Cases would go through lower federal courts, circuit, district, and could be appealed to the Supreme Court. Those appeals are not going to work anymore because of the majority that's on that court. And the evidence is already available, already visible. The Justice Department has not made one single move in the area of voter suppression, even though the media is covering day after day stories of voter suppression, not voter fraud. And while all of this is going on, all these efforts to suppress Native Americans in North Dakota, for example, where it's looking entirely likely that the Democrat Heidi Heitkamp will lose her re-election bid. Native Americans are being kept from voting because many of them who live on reservations don't have street addresses. And their registrations, their applications to vote are being turned aside because the registration requirements in North Dakota require a street address, and they don't have one. Agnes was pointing out during our chat before we went on the air that there's something going on there, she feels, and I think she's got a point. Because 9/11 terrorist alert system requires street addresses. And what that's meant was that the 9/11 initiative has caused many of these former post office box addresses to be given street addresses. Because the 9/11 alert system needs to know exactly where every residence is. So this is an incredible issue, this fear issue. It's fear of immigrants, fear that you'll be arrested for trying to vote, and the people most vulnerable to this are the ones most likely to vote Democrat. And there is so much evidence of it in a number of different places. And the Justice Department under Jeff Sessions has not made one move to do anything about it as yet. And it's more and more likely that we're not going to see that happen. There's more. And with a little bit less than 15 minutes left in our time together today, I do believe there's time to deal with this. This is an article that was in the Washington Post yesterday. Again, it's by Paul Waldman on the Supreme Court. And the degree to which it appears that the Supreme Court is injecting itself into the midterm elections as never before. And this is the one related to the question in the census about citizenship. I think we may have mentioned before, and you've probably read about this, that President Trump wants a question on citizenship included in the census, the upcoming census. And most of the experts, most election experts, are warning against this. They're arguing that this is going to cause the census to be inaccurate, because it's going to push those people whose citizenship is questionable into not answering that question because they don't want to reveal themselves if they're in the country illegally. So what they're going to do is not answer the census. And what that's going to mean is the census count, is going to be reduced by a lot because so many people won't do it because of that citizens question in it. Here's Waldman's point, and this one I think is incredibly important. Not only is the unequal or the inaccurate count on the census likely to be the outcome, the result, Waldman suggests that it's the objective. Because most of these questionable immigrants are in the nation's biggest cities. And what that means is if they don't complete the census, that's going to reduce the count in places that are most likely to go Democratic. So the result is that this is exactly what the administration wants. Is to suppress turnout responses on the census because it's going to lower the numbers and thereby lower the representation in Congress in certain key areas. But here's the kicker. The Commerce Department under Wilbur Ross has the administrative responsibility to do the census. The challenge of taking the census has been assigned to the Commerce Department under Wilbur Ross. And it's very clear that Wilbur Ross has not been honest in his testimony on this citizens question. Ross has been trying to make the case that the citizenship question idea came from the Justice Department, not the administration. And in testimony before Congress, and I'm trying to find a particular place. Oh, here it is. In testimony before Congress in response to a question about where the citizenship question idea came from, Ross said, the Department of Justice, as you know, initiated the request for inclusion of the citizenship question. Also, Ross was asked whether the president or anyone else at the White House had talked to him about the citizenship question. And he said, I'm not aware of any such. Yet there's evidence that Stephen Bannon, when he was in the White House, contacted Ross and asked him to speak about the possibility of a citizenship question with Chris Kobach, the Kansas Secretary of State anti-immigrant crusader. In other words, there's evidence, A, that Ross tried to get the Justice Department to request the citizenship question so that he could throw responsibility for it onto the Justice Department and away from him and away from the Commerce Department. And then when he was asked if the president had ever said anything to him, he denied it. When in fact there's evidence that that's not true. The fact of the matter is, there's a lawsuit been filed by a number of states challenging the citizenship question and threatening to call Ross as a witness. And this is where the Supreme Court stepped in. This past Monday, day before yesterday, the Supreme Court intervened to protect Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross from answering any of the lawyers' questions in this lawsuit. It was an unsigned order from the Supreme Court. In other words, it's unclear who voted for it, who voted against it, if anybody did. There obviously had to be 5 justices to issue the order at all, signed or not. But whether it's the 5 conservative justices or whether it's all 9 justices trying to argue that they want to stop the lawsuit until the Supreme Court has time to deal with it. The fact of the matter is, the Supreme Court has injected itself in this particular question by shielding Wilbur Ross from having to give testimony on the source of the citizenship question, even though there's evidence on 2 occasions that Ross lied about it to Congress. So the Supreme Court is directly injecting itself into a political issue related to the census and a political effort of the administration to repress the accuracy of the census because it would be politically advantageous to the Trump administration. There's a couple of things about this that are really frightening. One is the degree, the length to which the administration is going and the variety of different directions it's going in order to suppress votes, in order to suppress responses to the census, in order to reduce Democratic voting power by reducing the size of populations in solidly Democratic areas. There's evidence of cabinet members lying to Congress. Now there's evidence of the Supreme Court directly injecting itself into a political issue at the time of a critical election in a finding that's not signed. In other words, they don't even have to put their name on it. There were 2 dissenting opinions. The dissenting opinions was signed by Neil Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas. And the reason they dissented from the rest of the court is because they didn't believe that it went far enough. They didn't just want to protect Wilbur Ross from testifying. They wanted to protect everybody from testifying. Their argument being that lawsuits ought not to be filed against a government while it's governing, which is kind of the same thing if you think about it. That was such an issue. That was such an issue during the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. Kavanaugh's article in the Minnesota Law Journal arguing that the president should be free from investigations, lawsuits, and subpoenas while in office. Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas dissented against the Supreme Court ruling in the case of Wilbur Ross because they felt that it ought to involve more people than just Wilbur Ross. It ought to involve everybody in the administration. In other words, the administration says the court can do whatever it wants as long as its ability to govern is not infringed upon. When you put all of these together, the suppression of votes, the suppression of voter applications, the effort to plant fear in the population about this wave of migrants, making its way toward the southern border of the United States. The president's threat to monitor the polls carefully in order to try to find people who are committing voter fraud, and promising that if found, they will be dealt with severely. All of these things indicate clear efforts to suppress voting and guarantee a Trump victory. I think this is incredible. The possibility of it, the potential for it, has been there all along. We've talked about it. But the fact that it's actually happening, and the Justice Department is not doing anything about it, is incredible. Because what it means is all avenues of recourse are being closed. And now we get back to the election itself. If Republicans continue to control both houses of Congress, along with the White House, and now the Supreme Court, and these elections come and go and there's no change, there'll be no limits to what might happen. I hate to end on that kind of a negative note, but I think our time is up. We are just right at the top of the hour. For Agnes and Bob Kincaid and the folks at Head On, and for the Virtual Center and myself, Bill Obrien, thank you so very, very much for the honor, and I mean honor, of coming to you on a regular basis. I hope that you found the program informative, kind of interesting. I made a comment to Agnes at the break that I couldn't believe that the first hour was over, that it had gone by so fast. And I thought, boy, that didn't sound very good. That sounds like it was such an exciting, wonderful first hour that the time flew by. My point was it flew by for me. I don't know whether it did for other people or not. I hope it did. Anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week and a wonderful weekend. And if everything works out, we'll be back together the first of next week in a regular Monday program. Thank you so very, very much. Have a good day.